Okay, we can almost see Bill now as he kind of sits back and reviews what he's done up to this point. Probably says to himself, I've shown them the problem in the doctor's opinion. I've given them an example of a person who had that problem in my story. And he said, now then I think what I need to do is get right down to brass tacks and tell them exactly what the solution to that problem is going to be. And he wrote chapter 2, and I don't think it's by accident that he titled it, There is a Solution. There is a solution to the condition that Bill has just described in the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. And on this page, page 17, here we're going to see the prescription for alcoholism. If alcoholism is an illness, then the prescription for it is going to be found on page 17. And if our problem is powerless, then surely the answer would lie within power. So our prescription for alcoholism will be power. And on page 17, it's going to show us two kinds of power. It's going to talk about the power of the fellowship, and then it's going to talk about the power of the vital spiritual experience. And those two powers added together in anyone's life should be enough to overcome our powerlessness over alcohol. And he begins by talking about the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this is really about the only place in the book you'll ever see any information regarding our fellowship. He said, we of Alcoholics Anonymous know thousands of men and women who were once just as hopeless as Bill. Nearly all have recovered. They have solved the drink problem. We are average Americans. Now today we might say we're average citizens of the world. So we're in what, Joe? Some
156 countries, something like that.
150 some odd countries today. All sections of this country and many of its occupations are represented, as well as many political, economic, social, and religious backgrounds. We are people who normally would not mix. You know, I think today as we sit here in this room, we're probably the most mixed up group of people in this whole area up here. Here we see all kind of occupations. We see all kind of religions. We see all different economic backgrounds. We see different sexes. We see different ethnic backgrounds. And we are people who normally would not mix with each other. But there exists among us a fellowship, a friendliness, and an understanding which is indescribably wonderful. Even though we are so different from each other, there still exists among us this great fellowship and friendliness. Now he begins to describe this feeling that we have for each other by talking about something he assumes we already know about. Most good writers do this. Most good writers teach you something new or make a point by talking to you about something you already know about. You know, we had a great teacher that lived a couple of thousand years ago that was really good at this. And when he wanted to teach something to the shepherd, he would tell him a story about sheep, knowing full well the shepherd would understand it. But if he wanted to teach the same thing to the fisherman, he would change his story and it would be about fish instead of sheep. And then when he went to the farmer, he talked about cattle and grains. All good writers do this. Bill is going to talk about a great ocean liner, the moment after shipwreck. Now, back in the 1930s, this was the mode of travel between continents. There wasn't any air travel as we know it today. And on these great ocean liners, there was always a section in the bottom of the ship called the steerage section. And that was the cheapest way you could travel. Most of the immigrants from Europe to the United States traveled in the steerage section. Now, down in the steerage section, there was hardly any fresh air, dormitory-style living, and I like to refer to it as the cheese sandwich section. It wasn't too good, but you could get by down there. Now, if you had a little more money, though, and you wanted better accommodations, you could pay a little more cash and you could move into the fourth class section. Then if you had a little more money and wanted to, you could get into the third class, then into the second class, and then if you had enough money, you could get into the first class section. The first class section of the ship, of course, had the best staterooms, the best dining rooms, the best food, the best everything. But even that wasn't good enough. If you had the right kind of money,
money.
If you had the right religion, if you had the right everything, you might be invited to dine at the captain's table. And at the captain's table, this is where the elite of the ship would sit, and you really had to be somebody to be at the captain's table. Now, normally, the man from the captain's table, or woman, would never have met nor seen the one from the steerage section in their journey across the ocean. In fact, some of those ocean liners, they even had different stairwells, so you couldn't accidentally run into somebody from a different class and etc. But the moment of disaster, and you've got to think about the Titanic because that was fresh on everybody's mind, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, and these two guys were standing up on the deck, and the ship was sinking. One of them had on his tuxedo, his black tie, and the other one had on his overalls. They had nothing in common with each other, period, until they jumped overboard. And the instant their rear ends hit that cold water, they had something in common. And the thing they had in common is, how in the hell are we going to save ourselves from this mess? And they grabbed onto and they held on to anything they could get their hands on. And I doubt very seriously if the man from the captain's table took a financial statement from the man from the steerage section. They were so happy to be rescued. And when they got back on another ship and they got back on shore, they just held on to each other, and there was a feeling amongst them which was absolutely indescribably wonderful. That's the same feeling we have in AA today. You know, we don't care where you came from. We don't know how much money you got. We don't care what your religion is. We want to know one thing and one thing only. Are you an alcoholic? If you are, you've suffered the same thing the rest of us have, and there's a feeling amongst people who suffered the same thing that is an indescribably wonderful feeling. It's one of the most powerful things that you can possibly have. But then he said, unlike the feeling of the ship's passengers, however, our joy in escape from disaster does not subside as we go our individual ways. As soon as they got back to shore, they looked at each other, and they probably said, well, we don't belong together. And they separated and went their individual ways to never meet again. Our joy in escape from disaster does not subside because we'll always be alcoholics. And disaster always waits right outside the door. So this feeling of having shared in a common peril is one of the constant things that we have within the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. The feeling of having shared in a common peril is one element in the powerful cement which binds us, but that in itself would never have held us together as we are now joined. And I think what Bill is saying is this. Even though this feeling that you and I have for each other is extremely important, and even though it's a very powerful thing, that in itself would never have held us as we are now joined. The great fact, the tremendous fact for every one of us is that we have discovered a common solution. We have a way out on which we can absolutely agree, and upon which we can join in brotherly and harmonious action. This is the great news this book carries to those who suffer from alcoholism. Not the news of the fellowship, but the news of the common solution. And a little later on, we're going to see the common solution is the vital spiritual experience brought about by the program of action of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, if we can take the power of the fellowship and the power of the vital spiritual experience, add the two together, then that should overcome anybody's powerlessness over alcohol. I think one of the greatest tragedies going on in the world today, and I don't care about Somalia or any of the other places, one of the greatest tragedies is that we're spending in AA literally hundreds of thousands of dollars and hundreds and thousands of men and women work hours trying to attract more alcoholics to the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous when we've got literally thousands of them sitting around us who are already members of the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous are dying from untreated alcoholism. They are part of the fellowship, but they're not engaging in the common solution. And if they're not recovering. And sooner or later they end up going back to drinking. And they say, well, AA didn't work for me. No, they didn't work for AA. They didn't understand the need for the program, nor did they have anybody to help them work the program. I think our responsibility is to be sure that every newcomer understands this page. For those of us who are powerless, there's two powers. The power of the fellowship, the power of the vital spiritual experience. Fellowship alone is simply not sufficient. It supports us for a while, but it will not bring about recovery from alcoholism.
Okay, let's go to page 20 just for a moment.
A good book never tells you anything that it doesn't back it up. Now, the first half of this chapter, he uses to explain to you and I why fellowship alone is not sufficient. Then he uses the last half of this chapter to explain the common solution.
Okay, on page 20 it says, you may already have asked yourself why it is that all of us became so very ill from drinking. Doubtless you're curious to discover how and why, in the face of expert opinion to the contrary, we have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. Now, if you're an alcoholic who wants to get over it, you already may be asking, well, what do I have to do? Well, it's the purpose of this book to answer such questions specifically. Remember last night we talked about precisely, clear-cut, and specifically. Here's one of those words. We shall tell you what we've done, Before going into detailed discussion, it may be well to summarize some points as we see them. How many times people have said to us, I can take it or leave it alone. Why can't he? Why don't you drink like a gentleman or quit? That fellow can't handle his liquor. Why don't you try beer and wine, lay off the hard stuff? His willpower must be weak. He could stop if he wanted to. She's such a sweet girl, I should think he'd stop for her sake. The doctor told him that if he ever drank again, it would kill him. But there he is, all lit up again. Now, these are commonplace observations on drinkers which we hear all the time. Back of them is a world of ignorance and misunderstanding. We see that these expressions refer to people whose reactions are very different from our own. You know, in many, many places in Alcoholics Anonymous and around, outside of Alcoholics Anonymous, they would have us to believe that we have an illness of denial. Not in my case. It wasn't that I tried to deny anything, I was just ignorant. The book says, back of them is a world of ignorance and misunderstanding. In my case, I was just uninformed. I just didn't have the knowledge to base any right decisions on. So I wasn't trying to deny anything. I just didn't know. And if I'd have known, I'd have told those people that were asking me those questions when they said, what is your problem? And if I'd have known, I'd have told them. But I didn't know. So back of that was a world of misunderstanding and ignorance on my part.
Now, these expressions that Joe just read will refer to two kinds of drinkers. Let's see who they would refer to.
Now, moderate drinkers have little trouble in giving up liquor entirely if they have good reason for it. They can take it or leave it alone.
Remember, we talked about them last night. They have a couple drinks. They get a slightly tipsy, out of control, beginnings of a nauseous feeling. And they don't like to feel that way. Alcohol is no big deal for them. They can take it or they can leave it alone. Those expressions Joe read would certainly refer to the moderate drinker.
Then we have a certain type of hard drinker. Now, he may have the habit badly enough to gradually impair him physically and mentally. And it may even cause him to die a few years before his time. Now, if a sufficiently strong reason, ill health, falling in love, change of environment, or the warnings of a doctor becomes operative, if those things become operative, this man can stop or moderate, although he may find it difficult and troublesome and may even need a little medical attention.
We call this guy the heavy or the hard drinker. They drink like we alcoholics drink, but they are not alcoholic. If a good enough reason presents itself to them, they will do one of two things. They will either quit drinking entirely. They do not have the mental obsession. Or they may learn to moderate and control their drinking. They do not have the physical allergy. They drink like we alcoholics, but they're not alcoholics. These expressions that Joe read would refer to them also the same as to the moderate drinker. Now, you and I see these heavy drinkers all the time. They're the ones that say, when I was in the service, I was an alcoholic also. But when I got out of the service, I got married, went to church, quit drinking, don't see why in the hell you can't. They drink like us, but they are not alcoholics. But what about the real alcoholic? Now, he may start off as a moderate drinker. Many of us did. He may or may not become a continuous hard drinker. Many of us stayed periodic. But at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. Now, here's a fellow who's been puzzling you, especially in his lack of control. Now, we're going to have a description here of the real alcoholic. And when you see one of these descriptions in here that fit you, would you please hold your hand up? We'd like to know if we're in a room full of real alcoholics, Joe.
Charlie talked last night about crossing over that line. You know, I don't know what line he was talking about, but I know one thing. I was drunk when I went over it. Yeah. So here's a fellow who's been puzzling you, especially in his lack of control. He does absurd, incredible, tragic things while drinking. Yeah.
There goes my hand up.
He's a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Mm-hmm.
He is seldom mildly intoxicated, and he's always more or less insanely drunk.
Right.
His disposition while drinking resembles his normal nature, but little.
That's right.
So I always get good looking and out of debt, just like that when I start drinking.
Now, everybody holds their hand up on the next one.
Yeah. Now, he may be one of the finest fellows or gals in the world.
Yeah, everybody holds.
Yeah. But yet, let him drink for a day, and he frequently becomes disgustingly, even dangerously antisocial.
There I am again.
He has a positive genius for getting tight at exactly the wrong moment.
Yeah.
Particularly when some important decision must be made or engagement kept.
Everybody holds their hand up now on the next one.
He is often perfectly sensible and well-balanced concerning everything except liquor. But in that respect, he is incredibly dishonest and selfish.
Everybody loves the next one, too.
Yeah. He often possesses special abilities, skills, and aptitudes, and has a promising career ahead of him.
I've never heard anybody say that about us except we alcoholics, though. I've never heard an Al-Anon say that yet.
He uses his gifts to build up a bright outlook for his family and himself, and then pulls the structure down on his head by a senselessly serious sprees. He is a fellow who goes to bed so intoxicated he ought to sleep the clock around, yet early the next morning he searches madly for the bottle he misplaced the night before. Now, if he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over his house to be certain no one gets his entire supply away from him to throw down the wastepipe. As matters grow worse, he begins to use a combination of high-powered sedative and liquor to quiet his nerves so he can go to work. Then comes the day when he simply cannot make it and he gets drunk all over again. Perhaps he goes to a doctor who gives him morphine or some sedative with which to taper off. Well, I never did taper off. I always tapered on for some reason. Then he begins to appear at the hospital and sanitariums. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive picture of the true alcoholic, as our behavior patterns vary, but this description should identify him roughly.
I guess if our government's ever spent anything right in alcoholism, it's probably an education of the public as to what alcoholism is and what it isn't. And because of that education, many, many people are getting to AA before they have to do all these things that describe the real alcoholic. But I'll guarantee you, if you're a real alcoholic, you found yourself in there somewhere. At least one of them are going to fit you. In my case, almost every one of them. One in particular. If he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over his house to be sure no one gets his entire supply away from him. After I was sober 7 years, I sold a 45,000, 40-acre broiler chicken operation. Now, that's been now about 18 years ago. And every once in a while, even today, I meet the guy that bought it, and sometimes he'll just wave and he'll say, "Hey, Charlie, we have found another one." And he's referring to partially empty vodka bottles. They're behind corner posts, they're under rocks, they're in hollow trees, they're falling out of feed bins. God only knows how many more he's going to find before he's all through. Certainly I found myself there. Now here's the question. Why does he behave like this? If hundreds of experiences have shown him that one drink means another debacle with all its attendant suffering and humiliation, why is it that he takes that one drink? Why can't he stay on the water wagon? Now the moderate drinker can, the heavy drinker can. Why can't the alcoholic? What has become of the common sense and willpower that he still sometimes displays with respect to other matters? Perhaps there never will be a full answer to these questions. Opinions vary considerably as to why the alcoholic reacts differently from normal people. We're not sure why, once a certain point is reached, little can be done for him. We cannot answer the riddle. We know that while the alcoholic keeps away from drink, as he may do for months or years, he reacts much like other men. We are equally positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, something happens both in a bodily and mental sense, which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. The experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. Excuse me. Now, these observations, the one I just read, would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. Therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than in his body.
I'll read that again.
The main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than in his body. Our mind telling us we can drink rather than our body that ensures that we can't drink. And always, just before we take a drink now, we are stone cold sober. So the real problem centers in the mind. If you ask him why he started that last bender, the chances are he'll offer you any one of 100 alibis. Sometimes the excuses have certain plausibility, but none of them really make sense in the life the havoc an alcoholic's drinking bout creates. They sound like the philosophy of the man who, having a headache, beats himself on the head with a hammer so that he can't feel the ache. If you draw this fallacious reasoning to the attention of an alcoholic, he will laugh it off or become irritated and refuse to talk. Once in a while, he may tell the truth. Strange as it may seem. There are times we alcoholics tell the truth. Not too often, but once in a great while. I had a lady in AA, she came to me, or in Al-Anon, she came to me and she said, "Charlie, all he does is lie, lie, lie." She said, "How can you tell when one of you guys are lying?" I said, "Lady, watch him closely. And if you see his lips moving, he's probably lying to you." And then I said, "Do you want me to tell you how to keep him from lying?" And she said, yeah. And I said, "Don't ask him those stupid questions." The truth, strange to say, is usually he has no more idea why he took that first drink than you have. Some drinkers have excuses which are a satisfied part of the time, but in their hearts they really do not know why they do it. Once this malady has a real hold, they are a baffled lot. There is the obsession that somehow, someday they will beat the game, but they often suspect they are down for the count. Now here's the obsession of the mind. Obsession of the mind is an idea that overcomes all ideas to the contrary. The great obsession of every alcoholic is someday, somehow, we're going to beat the game. Someday, somehow, we're going to find some kind of alcohol we can drink and not get drunk. Someday, somehow, we'll find a group of people we can drink with and not. Someday, somehow. And that idea is so strong that it overcomes all ideas to the contrary, makes us believe we can drink. And we take a drink based upon a lie. The real problem of the alcoholic centers in the mind telling us we can drink, rather than the body that ensures that we can't drink. Page 24, squiggly writing.
That's italic.
We're going to take a break in just a few minutes, too.
The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We were without defense against the first drink. In other words, I have a wonderful memory, it's just short. The almost certain consequences that follow taking even a glass of beer do not crowd into the mind to deter us. If these thoughts occur, they are hazy and readily supplanted with the old threadbare idea that this time we shall handle ourselves like other people. There is a complete failure of the kind of defense that keeps one from putting his hand on a hot stove.
If you've burned your hand on a hot stove, chances are you're always going to remember how that felt. And you're probably not going to go back and put your hand on that stove to see if it'll burn you again. You know, I remember as a kid growing up during the Depression years, and there's a few of you in here old enough to remember that, I'm sure. And we didn't have very much in those days. We didn't have hot and cold running water. We didn't have forced air heat. In the wintertime, if we had any heat at all, we were lucky. We burned wood, we burned coal, we burned whatever we could.
Other people's houses? Whatever.
Other people's houses if we needed to. But it didn't make any difference how poor you were in those days. Cleanliness was still next to godliness. And everybody in the family had to take a bath on Saturday night. Now, whether you needed it or not is beside the point. You're still going to have a bath on Saturday night. And I remember one time in the middle of the winter, Mother had heated the bath water on the old heating stove in the living room, put it in a number 3 zinc wash tub and set it behind that stove, and every kid in the family takes a bath in the same water. Now, I'm the baby of the family. By the time it got to me, the crud would be about an inch thick on it. Mother would say, get in there and get clean, and I'd wonder how in the hell do I get clean in that mess. Didn't dare say that to her, though. And that particular night, I moved the crud to the side and got in the water and began to wash. Old heating stove sitting next to it, cherry red. And I bent over and accidentally stuck my rear against that red-hot heating stove. And I shall never forget it. It raised a blister on my rear end about as big as my hand. Hurt me worse than anything had ever hurt me up to that time. And do you know I've never had an obsession of the mind to stick my ass on a hot stove since then. Never have I jerked my britches down, backed up to a stove, and said, burn me again. Now, alcohol has burned me over and over and over and over, just as badly as that stove ever burned me. But for some strange reason, my mind can't remember that. Left on my own resources, when I start thinking about alcohol, I start thinking about the great sense of ease and comfort that comes at once with 2 drinks. I start thinking about what alcohol is going to do for me. I cannot remember what it does to me. And when you're in that condition, you're absolutely powerless when it comes to alcohol. Bottom of the page it says, when this sort of thinking is fully established in an individual with alcoholic tendencies, he's probably placed himself beyond human aid. And unless locked up, may die or go permanently insane. If we've placed ourselves beyond human aid, then the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous will not bring about recovery, because it's made up of a bunch of human beings who are just as powerless as we are when it comes to alcohol. Page 25, there is a solution.
We're going to take a break now, and then we're going to come back and talk about there is a solution, one solution. We're going to start getting well now.
If we don't get started, we'll be running way too late this afternoon. So let's go ahead on page 25. Let's start looking at the actual solution. If fellowship won't do the job, then what will?
He said there is a solution. He said almost none of us likes the self-searching, the leveling of our pride, the confession of shortcomings which the process requires for a successful consummation. But we saw that it really worked in others and had come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we'd been living it. When therefore we were approached by those in whom the problem had been solved, there was nothing left for us but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. So that's one thing I saw about the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. When I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't know anything, but I saw that it really worked in them, and that's the power of the fellowship. And I liked that. I saw that they were staying sober and they were happy about it, and I liked what they were doing and how they acted. And then they presented me with the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And said, we have found much of heaven, have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. The great fact is just this and nothing less, that we have had deep and effective spiritual experiences.
Now let's see what this deep and effective spiritual experience has done.
Which have revolutionized our whole attitude toward life, toward our fellows, and toward God's universe. The central fact of our lives today is the absolute certainty that our Creator has entered into our hearts and lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. He has commenced to accomplish those things for us which we could never do by ourselves. You know, when they begin to talk about deep and effective spiritual experiences, in the original printing of the book, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, this little asterisk was not there. At the bottom of the page it says, fully explained on Appendix 2. The information about the spiritual experience was not in that first printing of the first big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which left the reader of the book to assume that they were going to have these giant spiritual experiences, the one like Bill had and like the people in the back of the book had. You know, and then I began to look at this word spiritual experience and spiritual awakenings. It conjured up some old ideas within me, too. Because whenever I was a kid, about 8 or 9 years old, I told myself if I ever got big enough they couldn't catch me, I wasn't going anymore. The church, that is. And I got big enough they couldn't catch me, and I didn't go because I rejected those things even at that young age. So when I come to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had the spiritual knowledge of an 8 or 9 year old boy, which was practically none. And the knowledge that I did have scared the heck out of me. Because I can remember one time they caught me and they took me to this brush arbor that we had in the South. We have these revivals in the South. I don't know if you all have them up here or not. But what a revival is, that means that the local preacher's not doing a real good job. So they bring in an out-of-town preacher, kind of like Charlie and I.
You go to church every night of the week, too.
You go to church every night of the week, twice a day sometimes. You sing, and they have dinner on the ground, and they get into this music. And one night we were there, and my Aunt Much, she's a big woman, that's why they call her Much, Aunt Much. My Aunt Much got in the spirit of this thing. Boy, they were singing and dancing and praising God and all those sort of things, and she got to doing that. Then all of a sudden, she started talking in a language that I'd never heard before. I mean, it was weird. She started jumping up and down and singing and talking in this strange language, fell down on the ground, rolling around and all that stuff, and she was having a spiritual experience. So when they began to talk to me about spiritual experiences and spiritual awakenings, I thought that's what I was going to have. And I didn't, I was not looking forward to that at all. Didn't think I could have one. But they recognized this little error here, and they put that little asterisk in the book and said, fully explained on Appendix 2. And later on page 27, it will say, referring to the asterisk again, for further amplification, see Appendix 2. Then on page 47, it will say, please see Appendix 2. They want to make real sure that people like me understand what they're talking about. So it would be a good idea if I need to have a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening, it might be a good idea if I turn back to page 569 and find out exactly what they meant by that, because it certainly wasn't what I thought it was. So let's go back to page 569 and let's read about spiritual experience. It said the terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakenings are used many times in this book, which, upon careful reading, and we all know that alcoholics don't do any careful reading, show that the personality change, sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism, has manifested itself among us in many different forms.
Almost automatically, we begin to see him now using two terms, spiritual experience and spiritual awakening. In either case, what they're going to result in is a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. Your personality is made up by the way you think, by your ideas, by your attitude and outlook upon life, people, places, and things, period. If we can change from the old personality that we used to be, restless, irritable, discontented, filled with shame, fear, guilt, and remorse, to a new kind of personality, then we will have undergone a personality change or a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening, and Dr. Silkworth referred to it as a psychic change. So you may see any one of four terms indicating this. Spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, personality change, or psychic change.
And the spiritual experience is the sudden type, the one like Bill had and like some of the people in the back of the book have. And the other is a spiritual awakening because they develop slowly over a period of time. They do better. I say I always do better when I know better. And I awaken spiritually slowly over a period of time, which is the kind that I had. See, it is true that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. Well, happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. In the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes are described. Though it was not our intention to create such an impression, Many alcoholics have nevertheless concluded that in order to recover, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousness, followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. Among our rapidly growing membership of thousands of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent, are by no means the rule. Now, we see that happening all over AA today. A lot of people are having those sudden, spectacular upheavals. But this is frequent, but by no means the rule. Most of our experiences are what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop slowly over a period of time.
Usually, we're going to change as we learn. And as we learn and as we apply, our change comes about slowly over a period of time. We'll call that a spiritual awakening. If it's a sudden thing, we'll call it a spiritual experience. Now, in my particular case, I know when I first started working the steps, people around me could see that taking place in my life long before I could. My sponsor used to say, "Charlie, you're doing okay." And I'd say, "No, I'm not. Things aren't a damn bit better today than they were 2 years ago." He'd say, No, you're changing. You just don't realize that. Slowly, over a period of time, a spiritual awakening. But sooner or later, we awaken to the fact that we have changed. We'll know when we've had that spiritual awakening.
Yeah, they told me if you just don't drink, you're going to feel better. Well, I did. I felt better, all right. I felt resentment better. I felt anger better. I felt everything better. So quite often, friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he is himself. He finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life, that such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. What often takes place in a few months could seldom have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. With few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. Most of us think this awareness of a power greater than ourselves is the essence of spiritual experience. Our more religious members call it God consciousness. Most emphatically, we wish to say that any alcoholic capable of honestly facing his problems in the light of our experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. He can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. We find that no one need have difficulty with the spirituality of the program. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. And that principle is contempt prior to investigation. See, I knew so many things that were not true and made so many decisions based upon these things that were not true that it was almost impossible for me to learn anything that was true. I had to be able to give up some of my old ideas, lay them aside, investigate new, and this took a while. The process didn't happen the day I quit drinking. It took a while for me.
Probably the key word in this spiritual experience or spiritual awakening is the word change. We've already noticed that Bill liked to teach us something new by talking about something we already knew about when he did it on the Great Ocean Liner. And we need to point out another thing about Bill and most writers. Usually a writer repeats themselves quite often, but most of them will find a different word that means the same thing when they repeat themselves. And if you aren't careful, you'll think they're talking about something different when they're really talking about the same thing over and over. Let's see how many times he said change on page 569. And how many different ways he said it. In the first paragraph, he talked about a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery. In the second paragraph, he again mentioned personality changes. But then he said in the nature of a sudden and spectacular upheaval. An upheaval is to change something entirely. In the third paragraph, first sentence, he talked about sudden revolutionary changes. To revolutionize something is also to change it entirely. In the third paragraph, last sentence, he talked about immediate and overwhelming God consciousness. To overwhelm something is to change it. Third paragraph, last sentence, he talked about a vast change in feeling and outlook. Fourth paragraph, first sentence, he said such transformations. To transform something is to change it. Fourth paragraph, about the middle of the paragraph, he talked about a profound alteration. To alter something is to change it. So the key word here is change. Changing from that old restless, irritable, discontented type human being we used to be into a human being who has some sobriety, yet a little peace of mind, serenity, and happiness. And we can call that a spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, personality change, or psychic change. Now, the only people that fail at this are those that refuse to change. We can't continue to do and think and feel the way we've always felt and change at the same time. And the only ones that fail are those that refuse to change. And I'm like Joe. Contempt prior to investigation kept me from changing for a long time, because I certainly didn't want to see those things that I had seen back when I was a kid growing up, and I had closed my mind to all spiritual concepts. And it damn near killed me until I finally became willing to change. And then I found out the change is really not all that difficult.
When they talk about change to me, I told you last night, I stood in the back of the room looking down at my feet. I had become everything that I detested in a human being, and I couldn't stand to look you in the eye or myself in the eye. I just didn't like myself. So when they talked about change, I thought they meant for me to become something of what I'm not. So I looked around Alcoholics Anonymous, and I picked out some people that I liked. They're my heroes. And I think we all need our heroes, and I still do. I love my heroes today. But I've tried to become like them. Charlie was one of my heroes. I wanted to be like Charlie. And I almost made it. Almost. But there's only one problem with that. You can only be second best, you see. I can never, ever be Charlie. I can only be who and what I am. And I think the type of change that you're talking about for me is to change from what I have become to what God intends for me to be. Just me, personally. And that's a marvelous experience in Alcoholics Anonymous, to become that which God intended for me to be. Different, unique than anybody else. Just me, just one. And I think I like that idea. And I am becoming that. I'm not there yet, but I'm becoming that. And I like what I have become today. I like who I am and what I am. And I can look you in the eye, and I can look myself in the eye, and I'm not ashamed anymore as I used to be. So I am changing into becoming what God intends for me to be.
Let's go back to page 25, last paragraph. If you are seriously alcoholic as we were, we believe there is no middle-of-the-road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible, and if we'd passed into the region from which there's no return through human aid, we had but two alternatives. One was to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could.
Which is step one.
And the other to accept spiritual help.
Which is step two.
And you're going to see Bill repeating those two ideas over and over and over. It seems as though for we alcoholics, we have one of two choices. We can stay powerless, continue to drink until we die from alcoholism, or we can accept spiritual help. And that seems to be the only two choices we have. You know, one of your catchphrases in AA today is, you better not talk too much about God or you'll run the newcomer off. Well, you'll notice the book doesn't mind talking about God, and it doesn't mind giving us but these two alternatives. My old sponsor straightened me up in this area, and he said, Charlie, you don't need to worry about running a newcomer off about talking about God. He said, if you do, whiskey will put him right back in here every time. He said he has no place else to go. And probably when he comes back, then he'll be willing to talk about God. Now, where'd this idea come from? You know, we saw the idea of the problem. That came from a doctor in New York City named Dr. Silkworth. Let's see where this idea of the vital spiritual experience came from. Ebby brought it to Bill. But where did Ebby get it in the first place? Where did it actually come from?
It's on page 26. It says a certain American businessman had ability, good sense, and high character. And, of course, we all know that to be Roland Hazard. His family was a very wealthy family. They had plenty of money, was able to give him the best that money could buy. And for years he had floundered from one sanitarium to another. He had consulted the best-known American psychiatrist. Then he had gone to Europe, placing himself in the care of the celebrated physician, the psychiatrist Dr. Yoon, who prescribed for him. Now, he didn't go over there for a 28-day treatment program. He went over there for 1 full year, and one of the best psychiatrists the world has known, the best that money could buy, he was there, and he completely psychoanalyzed Roland from top to bottom in that 1 year, the very best that money could buy. Though experience had made him skeptical, he finished his treatment with unusual confidence. His physical and mental condition was unusually good. Above all, he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and his hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. Nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. More baffling still, he could give himself no satisfactory explanation for his fall. See, after his treatment, he got on the ship, came back to America, got drunk again, and now he goes back to the doctor because he is confused. He wants some more help. So he returned to this doctor whom he admired, and he asked him point blank why he could not recover. He wished above all things to regain self-control. He seemed quite rational and well-balanced with respect to other problems, yet he had no control whatever over alcohol. Why was this? Well, he begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth, and he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to place himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. This was a great physician's opinion. You know, this physician, Dr. Yoon, a very humble man, could have said to Roland, Roland, I think you have a Valium deficiency. Obviously, you have plenty of money. Keep coming back and we'll continue to treat you. But he didn't do that. A humble man that he was, he said to him, I've done all that I can possibly do for you. Psychiatry has done all that we possibly can do for you, and you're going to have to hire a bodyguard or place yourself under lock and key if you expect to live long. This was a great physician's opinion.
But this man still lives, and he's a free man. He does not need a bodyguard, nor is he confined. He can go anywhere on this earth where other free men may go without disaster, provided he remains willing to maintain a certain simple attitude. Now, some of our alcoholic readers may think they can do without spiritual help. Let us tell you the rest of the conversation our friend had with his doctor. The doctor said, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I've never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you. Our friend has felt as though the gates of hell had closed on him with a clang. He said to the doctor, is there no exception? Yes, replied the doctor, there is. Exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements.
Change.
Ideas, emotions, and attitudes which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side.
Change.
And a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them.
Change.
In fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement within you.
Change.
With many individuals, the methods which I employed are successful, but I've never been successful with an alcoholic of your description, asterisk, bottom of the page, for amplification, see Appendix 2. They want to be sure we understand what this spiritual experience is. That is nothing more than a change in our attitude and outlook upon life, discarding old ideas and old attitudes and beginning to operate on a new set of ideas and a new set of attitudes. Now, this information came from a psychiatrist on the other side of the world. This guy named Dr. Jung. You know, as Joe says, he could have just as easily said, I believe you're suffering from a Valium deficiency. Keep coming on back here. But he didn't do that. No, he said, Roland, I've done all I can do for you. With all my knowledge of the mind, I can't help you any further. You're probably going to die from alcoholism. And Roland said, are there no exceptions? And this little doctor was great enough to be able to go outside of his profession and say, yeah, I've seen people like you have what are called vital spiritual experiences. He said, I don't understand them at all, but I have seen it happen. Now, we don't know whether he advised Roland to get into a spiritual setting or not, but we do know that Roland came back from Europe, got in the Oxford groups, had a vital spiritual experience, then he carried that message to Ebby, and then Ebby carried that message to Bill. You know, we people who are so proud of our 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, I think we need to stop sometimes and look and see where they really came from. You know, the idea of the problem, step 1, came to us from a non-alcoholic neurologist MD in New York City. The idea of the solution to that powerless condition came to us from a non-alcoholic psychiatrist named Dr. Jung on the other side of the world. The program of action necessary to find the spiritual experience came to us from a group of people who were non-alcoholic people practicing first century Christianity to the best of their ability. So everything that we have came to us from those sources, mainly non-alcoholic people. Surely God got tired of seeing us die and decided to put this thing together and let this information lodge in Bill's mind so Bill in turn could write our program for us. It just couldn't have been done in any other way. You know, sometimes I laugh today when I think, let's get us an MD, and let's get us a psychologist, and let's get us a Baptist preacher, and let's put them all in a room and say, come up with the answer to alcoholism. You know, there's no way that could work. But that's where all this information came from. An absolute miracle. Joe?
You know, Dr. Silkworth knew what the problem was, but he didn't have a solution for it. Excuse me, Dr. Jung knew what the solution was, but he didn't know what the problem was. You know, the Oxford groups had a planned program of action, but they didn't know about the problem or the solution. All of this stuff gelled in the mind of one person, Bill Wilson, and he was able to put it down. Now let's look what has happened since this time. Whenever Roland went over there to see Dr. Jung, and he told Dr. Jung said to him that here and there, once in a while, just once in a while, people will have what are called vital spiritual experiences. And to me, these are a phenomenon. I do not understand them. You know, up until that point, it was just here and there, once in a while. After all of this information gelled in the mind of Bill Wilson, and he put all this information down in this book, today we can look at each other and the new people and each other in this room and say to each other that here and now, every time an alcoholic will apply these ideas and these principles to their life, they too can have a spiritual awakening. A wholesale miracle has happened in our lifetime, if you will, from that time to now. Literally millions of people all over the face of this earth have took the ideas out of this book and applied it to their lives, and they've had spiritual experiences or spiritual awakenings, and their lives have transformed and they have changed. Back in those days, it was just here and now, once in a while. See, a great thing has happened. And that's what we've got to sell in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's all we have to sell. That is the primary purpose of Alcoholics Anonymous, if you will. It's not all of those other things that we sometimes contribute to that. It simply is that we have a program called Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. And if we will apply these things to our life here and now, we can have a vital spiritual experience and we won't have to drink anymore. Isn't that something? It's a great thing. I love these ideas in this book.